Good evening and welcome everyone. I'm Marilee McFarland, the Senior Director of Principia Alumni and Field Relations, and the music you heard as you were joining is from Principia alum Ian Case. In the spring of 1999, Principia College hosted a special talk with John Lewis as the moral courage speaker. Today, former Principia College history professor Dr. Glen will give us a book talk on Jon Meacham's New York Times bestseller, His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope. We are so grateful that you've joined us for this talk. If you would like to learn more about this subject of civil rights, we invite you to join us in March of 2022 on the Principia Lifelong Learning Trip, Civil Rights, A Journey to Freedom with Dr. Billy Miller. This trip is an intimate and essential opportunity to explore the Deep South with an informative program about the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. So we hope that you will join us. We will put the link to the website where you can learn more about this trip and add your name to the interest list. We have a few more events coming up in April that we hope that you will join us for. I'm excited to announce our April book club pick, The Night Portrait, a novel of World War II and Da Vinci's Italy by Laura Morelli. We hope that you will join us for this book talk led by Linda Conradi on Thursday, April 29th. You can look forward to more virtual events in April, including a special talk by Principia Early Childhood Principal Dorothy Halverson on teaching the Bible and spiritual concepts to young children. We will be sending out emails with reminders and more information about all of the April events. During the talk today, you're welcome to submit your questions in the Q&A box throughout the talk. And my colleague, Robbie Butler, Principia's Leadership Gift Officer, will be moderating the Q&A following Dr. Glen's talk. Today's talk is being recorded and will be posted tomorrow on our virtual events webpage. There you can also find recordings of the concerts and talks over the last 10 months. We'll post that link in the chat box. Before I turn the screen over, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker. Dr. Jon Glen joined the staff at Principia College in 1989, and in 1993, he was appointed to the college faculty as an assistant professor of history. He stayed at Principia College until 2009, when he became the chair of the Humanities and Social Sciences Department at St. Louis Community College. In 2014, Jon and his wife, Dorsey, the former dean of students at the college, made an amazing decision and retired and moved to Maui. Jon has been a lecturer on Principia Lifelong Learning trips and at summer session. We are so grateful that he's prepared this talk for us today. Please join me in giving a warm aloha to Dr. Jon Glen.
Well, thanks, Marilee. It's such a pleasure to be with you today. Can you hear me, Marilee? Is it okay?
Yeah, we can hear you just great.
Okay, good. The book we're going to talk about today then is the Jon Meacham's book about John Lewis, just recently published last year. Lewis just passed, as you're all aware. This is Jon Meacham here. Meacham is contributing editor for the New York Times Book Review and a Pulitzer Prize winner in history and author on biographies on President George Herbert Walker Bush, Thomas Jefferson, and Andrew Jackson. And he serves various roles at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. And I'm informed that he has just been named the canon historian for the Washington National Cathedral. And in this role, he will lead discussions on issues of faith, spirituality, and civic life. And one such discussion will focus on the life of Georgia Congressman and civil rights icon, John Lewis. So Meacham is well-versed in what's going on with John Lewis. Lewis's mother used to tell him, "Don't get in trouble, don't get in trouble." But one of Lewis's great phrases is, "It's okay to get in good trouble or necessary trouble." And people are asking Lewis all the time, what can we do? And in the book, Lewis responds, what can we do? He says, what can we do? We have to try, we have to seek, we have to speak up. America can be saved, he says. One of the challenges that my students used to have when I was teaching was putting things in context. I used to show them different documents, and I'd ask them to write a one-page essay on the document. And the challenge that they had was putting the document in context. So I want to talk today about civil rights movement and put it in context. The civil rights movement that we're talking about, that John Lewis was involved in, is essentially the 1950s and the 1960s. And that's what Meacham's book focuses on as well. And these, of course, the 1950s are the years of Dwight Eisenhower, elected president in 52 and 56, and of course, one of the main heroes to come out of World War II. It's also the years of the fear of communism. This is Joe McCarthy, the junior senator from Wisconsin, who is speaking out against potential communists in the State Department. And he tells a group of ladies at a speech that he has in his hand the names of over 200 card-carrying communists currently working in the State Department. That number changes all the time, and McCarthy is seen finally as a rabble-rouser and demagogue and censured by the Congress, by the Senate, and the whole thing with regard to the communists in the State Department is seen to be a re-election ploy on McCarthy's part. And one of the people that he's after is a guy named Alger Hiss, who was actually Undersecretary of State in the Truman administration. And Hiss, like a lot of intellectuals during the 1930s, had dabbled in the Communist Party. During the Depression, a lot of people were wondering whether democracy was actually going to succeed because of the major problems during the Depression. And a lot of intellectuals, as I say, joined the Communist Party or looked at the Communist Party or thought about socialism and those kinds of things. Hiss was finally convicted of perjury and did some short jail time. Richard Nixon also gains his popularity at this time as coming out as an anti-communist representative, and then senator, and then of course vice president. The Koreans from North Korea attacked their neighbors to the south in the summer of 1950, and the Korean War ensues. You can see here they drive the South Koreans all the way down to the Pusan perimeter, all the way down in southeastern South Korea. And then Douglas MacArthur stages a dangerous but successful invasion at Incheon, you can see on the western shore of South Korea. And the UN forces, the United Nations forces, drive the North Koreans all the way up to the Chosin Reservoir. And they are threatened then by Chinese intervention. MacArthur is convinced that the Chinese will not intervene, but they do, of course, and drive the UN forces back down to the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. This is MacArthur in Korea. Arthur made some statements that Harry Truman took as irresponsible, and Truman and MacArthur had it out. And of course, MacArthur's not been in a situation like that, Truman being the commander-in-chief. And Truman relieves MacArthur, and General MacArthur comes home and speaks to a joint session of Congress in which he asserts that old soldiers never die, they just fade away. And like the old soldier in that ballad, I now propose to just fade away. Well, of course, that was the last thing that MacArthur had in mind. He wanted to run for president in 1952, but Eisenhower gets the nod from the Republicans. TV comes into its own in the 1950s. In 1950, 10% of the American public owned televisions. And in 1960, just a decade later, 90% of American public owned TVs. And I remember when I was a kid, we didn't have a TV, and I used to go up to the neighbor. His name is Cliffy. I used to go up and watch cartoons with Cliffy, and my dad always got a good laugh out of me going up to Cliffy's house. Peanuts gang are introduced in the 1950s with Charlie Brown and Snoopy and all their friends. Good movies of the 50s. One was From Here to Eternity. Burt Lancaster and Montgomery Clift talked about the beginnings of World War II with an Army unit stationed at Pearl Harbor. And The Bridge on the River Kwai with Alec Guinness and William Holden, one of my favorite movies. Westerns were big in the 1950s, and this is one of my favorites as well, called Shane with Alan Ladd and Jean Arthur. And if you've ever seen it, Brandon DeWilde's crying out for Shane, come back, lives with you forever. And one of the reasons I really like it is because of Jack Palance. He is the quintessential bad guy in Western movies, even wears a black hat. I mean, you gotta love that. In TV, we have Barbara Billingsley, Hugh Beaumont, Tony Dow, and Jerry Mathers as the Beaver. Leave It to Beaver. One of my favorite characters on that show was Eddie Haskell. He was always saying nice things to Mrs. Cleaver or Mr. Cleaver, and then behind their back, he was calling them names. McDonald's was selling hamburgers for 15 cents, and believe it or not, they had actually sold over 1 million hamburgers. I believe they've sold more than 1 million now. Disneyland opens in 1955, and it is, as you all know, the happiest place on earth. In the civil rights field, the controlling case of the United States Supreme Court was Plessy versus Ferguson. It's an 1896 case and was decided 7-1. 7 of the United States Supreme Court justices voted for separate but equal. The argument was that if everything is equal, then they can continue to be separate. But of course, rarely was it equal. 1947, Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier in professional baseball. This is Jackie playing for the Kansas City Monarchs in what was called the Negro Leagues. And Branch Rickey, who was a part owner of the Dodgers and the kind of the managing partner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, brings Jackie up in 1947 to play in the major leagues. The Brooklyn Dodgers, you might be interested to know, their name comes from, they were originally called the Brooklyn Trolley Dodgers, and then just shortened the name to the Dodgers. 1948, Harry Truman signs Executive Order 9981, which abolishes racial discrimination in the military. And at the time, the African Americans are living under what's called Jim Crow laws. White and colored restrooms, white and colored drinking fountains, help wanted white only. In Alabama, there were separate toilet facilities. In Georgia, a colored barber could not serve as a barber to white women or girls. There were segregated telephone booths in Oklahoma. In Wyoming, marriages between whites and Negroes were illegal and void. And in Mississippi, there were separate schools, of course. This name, Jim Crow, you might be interested to know, was the name of a fictitious character begun early on, who was in the minstrel shows. And the character's name was Jim Crow. And he would, he was a white guy, and he would dance and sing in blackface. And you can see here some of the signs that were up in the early part of the 20th century: colored served in the rear, no dogs, Negroes or Mexicans, and a disturbing picture there to our right of a lynching of 2 African Americans. Thought you might be interested to know that the origins of the lynch law dates all the way back to the American Revolution, when this guy Charles Lynch was essentially a vigilante, and he was punishing Tories and other criminals, and it gets to be known as Lynch's Law and then just Lynch Law. Black African Americans seen in the movies. This is were almost always played by white guys appearing in blackface. And this is D.W. Griffith's famous movie, The Birth of a Nation. This actor is actually a white guy. This movie celebrates the Ku Klux Klan. And this is Al Jolson in The Jazz Singer. He's also a white guy appearing in blackface. And this is Shirley Temple, believe it or not, appearing in blackface in a movie, 1930s. Of course, the Ku Klux Klan that you're all well aware of, in many states, very popular just after the Civil War, and then has a resurgence in the 1920s and 1930s. And you can see here this large group of Klansmen and women marching down Pennsylvania Avenue with the Capitol in the background. I think this is from the early 30s. So now Brown versus Board of Education, the date is 1954, and it declares this is a case that overturns Plessy versus Ferguson. And this case is decided 9-0. Plessy, as you remember, decided 7-1. In this case, Brown versus Board of Education declares that racial segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. This is actually Linda Brown, who was the girl whose father was suing the Topeka Board of Education to allow her to attend public school with the white kids. And you can see the white kids in the background there sort of giggling as what's going on. Thurgood Marshall, seen in the center here, was the attorney who argued the case before the United States Supreme Court, Brown versus Board of Education, and is victorious. And interestingly enough, 16 years later, Thurgood Marshall is appointed to the United States Supreme Court by President Lyndon Johnson. So the big news in '54 is that the High Court bans segregation in public schools. In the summer of 1955, Emmett Till was visiting his uncle in Mississippi. He's from Chicago. And the facts are unclear, as they say here, as to whether he whistled at a white woman or maybe even tried to touch her. A couple of nights later, the woman's husband and brother kidnapped Emmett Till and murder him. And the murderers were acquitted of the crime. And then, of course, this is Rosa Parks. And the date for this one is December of '55. Rosa is a seamstress in Montgomery, and she's tired of having to move seats in the local bus. The first 10 rows were designed and held for whites. And so she's sitting in actually the 11th row, and the whites fill up the bus, and she's asked to move to even further back, and she refuses to do so. She has a connection to the civil rights movement. She is a secretary for the NAACP in Montgomery, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And she's had a long day, and she's just sick of having to move and chooses not to. And so she's arrested for her activities. This results in the Montgomery bus boycott, which John Lewis says was the defining factor in him choosing to become involved in the civil rights movement. For over a year, Blacks refused to ride Montgomery buses, and they organized carpools, and they walked to work and rode bicycles, and even the Black cab drivers would give Black citizens in Montgomery a ride in their cab for 10 cents, whereas normally it would be much, much more expensive. But that was what it cost to ride the bus. And so the cab drivers were trying to support the efforts at civil rights as well. This is kind of an interesting story. This is a girl named Claudette Colvin. And prior to Rosa Parks being arrested and making her efforts at civil rights, this girl was arrested for not giving up her seat to a white person. This takes place about 9 months before Rosa Parks' activity. And this girl, unfortunately, was a 15-year-old girl, and she was unmarried and pregnant. And the NAACP decided that she wouldn't be a good voice for their efforts at that time. And so she is not brought forward after she decides not to give up her seat, and they wait on Rosa Parks, and you know the rest with regard to the Rosa Parks story. Shortly after that, in September of '57, there's an effort to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. The governor is preventing the integration of this previously all-white school, and he calls out the Arkansas National Guard to prevent what's called the Little Rock Nine from entering Central High School. Eisenhower is so put out at this, President Eisenhower, that he federalizes the Arkansas National Guard and also sends about 1,000 members of the 101st Airborne, the active duty Army, down to escort the Little Rock Nine into Central High School in Little Rock and integrate the high school. So if you were a National Guardsman in Arkansas, one day you were preventing the Little Rock Nine from entering Central High School, and the next day you were escorting them to enter Little Rock High School. Must have been pretty confusing for the National Guardsmen. This is the famous picture of Elizabeth Eckford in the foreground and Hazel Bryant shouting epithets at her. Unfortunately, Elizabeth's family did not have a telephone, and so she was not informed. She didn't get the message about all of the nine, the Little Rock Nine, traveling to Central High School that very first day all together, kind of string. And Elizabeth shows up by herself. The other 8 traveled together, but Elizabeth shows up by herself attempting to enter Central High School. And this is Elizabeth Bryant and numerous other whites giving her a rough time. A very interesting story between Elizabeth and Hazel. In 1963, Hazel, the white girl, calls Elizabeth to apologize on her own, and they become friends, apparently. There's even a poster made, this one here, which argues for reconciliation. And the two appear on the Oprah Winfrey Show and talk about their experiences, both during that civil rights activity and their lives later on. And even a book comes out called Elizabeth and Hazel, Two Women of Little Rock. It's unclear whether the friendship was actual or just put together for propaganda purposes. They become estranged after they are together on Oprah's show, and I believe they are still estranged, but an interesting book nonetheless. About 1960, we start seeing sit-ins. This is taking place in Greensboro, North Carolina, where African-American, mostly young males, would go into a place like the F.W. Woolworth store, seat themselves at the lunch counter, order a Coke or a cup of coffee, and sit there for numerous hours, preventing other patrons from sitting in the seats and ordering their lunch in an attempt to establish civil rights. This is when John Lewis first gets involved. This is him being carried out of a lunch counter after a demonstration in Nashville and put in the paddy wagon and taken to the jail where he's fingerprinted and all the rest. Lewis is arrested 43 times for civil disobedience. In music, rock and roll begins, of course, in the 1950s. This is Bill Haley and his group called the Comets, and they're singing Rock Around the Clock. And of course, the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley. When you appeared on Ed Sullivan, which Elvis did, once you did your act, and then if Ed was standing in the wings, and if Ed motioned you over and actually spent some time speaking with you, your career was in real good shape. And Ed motions Elvis over. Middle America was quite concerned about Elvis. You know, he had this greasy hair and this sort of a snarl on his face, and he'd roll his cigarettes up in his t-shirt sleeve. And a lot of Americans were concerned that he was giving the wrong impression to teenagers. But Ed invites him over and they have a short conversation, and Ed tells America on his nationally syndicated program that this is a fine young man. And middle America is satisfied and they begin to accept Elvis. And Elvis probably would have made it on his own. He had a wonderful voice and a wonderful stage presence. But the interview with Ed Sullivan on the TV show guarantees his career to be successful. Also in the music industry in the 1950s, Fats Domino, a piano player from New Orleans, Buddy Holly, and Roy Orbison from Waco, Texas. Jumping ahead just slightly, the day the music died, February 3rd, 1959, plane crash, Ritchie Valens, Buddy Holly, and the big bopper, J.P. Richardson, are all killed in the plane crash near Clear Lake, Iowa, as they're on. 1957, the Russians launch Sputnik, and the space race begins. Dr. Seuss becomes popular in the 1950s, and as you're well aware that Dr. Seuss has just been in the news recently that some of his books are seen as racist. Shelves of some libraries and some bookstores. 1959, Fidel Castro achieves power in Cuba, and now there is a communist nation just 90 miles from Florida's shores. This is a picture of Fidel Castro and Nikita Khrushchev, who is the prime minister, or if you will, of the Soviet Union. And the two of them now embrace the theory of communism. This is a scene from the very popular TV shows. This one is from a show called 21. And what they would do is they would place two individuals in isolation booths and ask them questions, and they had to answer. And the first one to 21 won the day and won the money. And the guy on the left is Charles Van Doren, and the guy on the right is Herb Stempel. And the quiz show became a scandal because they were actually given the questions and answers beforehand. And Van Doren was quite an actor. And in this series of pictures, you can see him really making an effort to try and answer the question that they had just asked him, when before the show, they had told him what the question was going to be, and they had told him what the answer was. And so big scandal during the 1950s, and a great movie called Quiz Show. Both Alaska and Hawaii are admitted to the Union in 1959, and we now become a 58 union. 1960 sees the election of Jack Kennedy versus Richard Nixon and the first televised debates. A lot of historians and other folks have argued that the debates made the difference and got Kennedy elected. 70 million viewers tuned in to watch, and they saw a Jack Kennedy who was tanned and rested and very conversant with the issues, and they saw Richard Nixon who was not so. He had been in an automobile accident prior to the first debate, had a car door slammed on his knee, and he was doing hospital time. He was an excellent debater and thought that he knew virtually everything that he needed to say, and so he wasn't doing much prepping, if you will, for the debate, whereas Kennedy was. And just before the debate, Nixon had heard that Kennedy had actually taken some makeup, and so Nixon wanted to have some makeup as well, and they'd given him the wrong kind of makeup, and it actually began to run under the hot lights of the television cameras, and so Nixon didn't make a very good impression. About this same time, Martin Luther King Jr. is arrested in Georgia, and he's going to be sent to a pretty dangerous prison where it's possible that his life would be in danger. Jack Kennedy hears about this. This is during the campaign. Jack Kennedy hears about it, and he calls Coretta Scott King to offer his advice and help. And he has his brother Bobby call the prison in Georgia and have Martin Luther King move to a separate location where he will be safe. Martin Luther King Sr. hears about this and begins to speak in favor of the Kennedy election. And of course, Kennedy wins by Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson as President Kennedy at the Berlin Wall as it's just being completed. And he gives his famous speech there, Ich bin ein Berliner, 1961. The Freedom Rides begin in March of 1961. Thirteen black and white students begin a bus ride from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans to protest racial segregation in interstate commerce. John Lewis is one of them. And he and this white guy, I can't remember this white guy's name, at the time, are beaten in Rock Hill, North Carolina. And you can see splotches of blood on Lewis's coat and shirt. And this other guy took a heck of a beating as well. The outside of Anniston, Alabama, one of the buses is firebombed. No one is killed in the confrontation, but another bus is brought in and the Freedom Riders are able to continue their trip to Birmingham, Alabama. And some people have argued even that Birmingham, Alabama was targeted because of, he's essentially the police chief. He's called the Commissioner of Public Safety. And his picture is down here in the far bottom right. His name is Bull Connor. And he gets the nickname of Bull because he had been a TV or at least a radio announcer, and a lot of the things that he did were seen as not actually accurate. And so he gets the nickname of Bull. And it's in Birmingham that a lot of the members of the NAACP were convinced that he would overreact, and he does, with the police dogs and the fire hoses. Robert Kennedy, who is the Attorney General of the United States at this time, makes some frantic phone calls to help the civil rights protesters. In October of '62, you remember the attempts by the Soviet Union to install offensive missiles in Cuba, in Castro's Cuba. Kennedy decides on a blockade, and it is successful, and the Russians turn back their ships. Little known is that we actually agreed to remove our offensive missiles from Turkey in a secret agreement, but the entire program looks like a major win for the United States against the Russians in what's called at the time the Cold War. In June of '63, Governor George Wallace stands in the doorway of the University of Alabama, preventing the integration of the University of Alabama. The guy on our far right is Nicholas of himself and allow the University of Alabama to be integrated. And of course, in August of '63, the March on Washington begins. This is prior to the March of Washington. President Kennedy has a number of the leaders and speakers into the White House, and the third from the left is Martin Luther King, and the fourth from the left is John Lewis. And President Kennedy, standing next to President Kennedy is A. Philip Randolph, and Vice President Johnson also in the picture. The white guy on President Kennedy's left is Walter Reuther, also one of the speakers at the March on Washington. 250,000 people attend the march, and in addition, 3,000 media are there as well. And the speaking is taking place in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and you can see the Washington Monument in the distance past the reflecting pool. 250,000 people. A. Philip Randolph, who had been active in civil rights for quite some time, he was the head of the sleeping car porters union speaks, as does Walter Reuther, who you see here, the white guy touching Martin Luther King. Walter Reuther was the head of the United Auto Workers, a very powerful union at the time. And John Lewis, a young John Lewis, is also one of the speakers. And of course, Martin Luther King gives his famous I Breathe speech. Fast forward to November of '63, President Kennedy and his wife Jackie make that ill-fated trip to Dallas, and horrible things happen over the weekend. This is Teddy on the left, Teddy Kennedy, and Jackie in the center, and Bobby on the right, and Caroline in front of her mother, and John Jr. as the procession passes. Horrible weekend. Those of you who are alive at the time remember it well as just a very unpleasant situation. So Vice President Johnson becomes President of the United States, and Johnson signs several acts, voting rights acts and other acts for supporting civil rights. And you can see Martin Luther King directly behind President Johnson. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which are passed just after the Civil War, in fact called the Reconstruction Acts or the Civil War Acts, are essentially ignored until Kennedy and Johnson begin to revive them, and now a number of acts from the Congress and signed by the president are supporting civil rights. In June of '64, these three civil rights workers disappear in Philadelphia, Mississippi. They are later found to have been murdered, probably by members of the Ku Klux Klan. Their bodies are found in an earthen dam. And a great movie about this is called Mississippi Burning. Gene Hackman does an exceptional role as a FBI agent. One of my favorite movies. Also powerful movies, West Side Story and The Sound of Music with Julie Andrews. And on TV, MASH, M-A-S-H, the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, starring Alan Alda as the chief surgeon, Trapper John. Cars at the time, a '65 Cadillac Eldorado and a '64 Mustang, a 1960 Corvette that the guys used to drive on the TV show Route 66. 1964, the Beatles arrive in America. Of course, very, very popular. John, Paul, George, and Ringo. The Motown sound is also very popular. These are the Supremes, Diana Ross on the far right. They start out in Motown as the Supremes, and then they become Diana Ross and the Supremes. And then of course, Diana Ross goes out on her own doing a single. Demonstrations often by mostly students or get out of Vietnam in favor of civil rights. Martin Luther King is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Here he is with John Lewis, marching and advocating for voting rights and other civil rights. In March of '65, they begin this march from Selma to Montgomery. They want to march to Montgomery to argue to the governor that he become an advocate for civil rights. This is Lewis in the foreground as they cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. Edmund Pettus had been a Confederate general and was also a Grand Dragon in the Ku Klux Klan after the war. They're met by Alabama state troopers and prevented from going forward, and tear gas is used on them, and a number of them are actually beaten. And this is Lewis being accosted by the police. And here is Lewis in the foreground here on his knees being beaten by Alabama state troopers. Lewis and Martin Luther King Jr. This is Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Malcolm X had started out as an advocate for violent civil rights. He believed that that was the way to accomplish what they wanted. He finally changes his mind, complete turnaround, and becomes an advocate for nonviolent activity in civil rights. He's finally March of '68, President Johnson stuns the American public by announcing that he will not run for re-election in '68. The civil rights movement and the war in Vietnam had just gotten to be too much for him, and he chooses not to run. April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in Memphis at the Laurel Lane Hotel, which is now a civil rights museum. The first guy that you see on the far left there pointing is one of the members of Martin Luther King group, Jesse Jackson, and you can see Martin Luther King's body laying on the ground. They're all pointing at where the gunfire had come from. James Earl Ray, as you're well aware, is arrested and convicted of the crime. In February of '68, Eugene McCarthy had run, a Democrat, had run against President Johnson in the New Hampshire primary and done quite well. And when he does this, Robert Kennedy then decides that he will throw his hat into the ring, as the phrase is, and run for president since Johnson. And this is the last picture of Bobby Kennedy with his wife, and the white guy over Bobby's left shoulder is Walter Reuther, this guy that spoke at the March on Washington. And it's shortly after this that Bobby Kennedy's entourage decides to have him leave the Ambassador Hotel through the kitchen area, and that's where he is assassinated. Horrible, horrible year, 1968. Vietnam now, 1954, the French are attempting to regain Indochina as a colony, and they are defeated by the Viet Minh in May of 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Someone has to step into the void. The French give up and stop attempting to gain communism in Southeast Asia, so the Americans begin. This is an or on the far left, one of the advisors to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. His name is Jean-Paul Van. The Gulf of Tonkin in August of '64 allows President Johnson to respond to any attacks by the North Vietnamese and gives him essentially carte blanche to do whatever he wants to do in Vietnam. And the Americans, what they're going to do, different than the French, is they're going to bring their troops in by helicopter. And at the time, it appears that the Viet Cong, they're now called, they often will fight where they choose to fight and run away when they choose to run away. And the Americans feel that they can bring in sufficient numbers to prevent this from happening and force the Viet Cong to stand and fight where they can be decimated by firepower. And if you can get, with a low fuel load, you can get 10 troops onto a Huey helicopter. And so if you've got 50 helicopters, you can bring in, 500 guys pretty quickly. This is the American effort in Khe Sanh, outside of, on the border almost of South Vietnam with Laos and North Vietnam. And Johnson becomes obsessed with holding this particular position, when in fact the North Vietnamese are planning attacks on over 100 major cities and provincial capitals, and it's called the Tet Offensive. This time, this is the swing. It's a decisive military victory for the South Vietnamese and the Americans, but a political victory for the North Vietnamese. The Americans are fighting to try and get back into the embassy compound where some Vietnamese sappers have. And this picture is another one of the famous pictures to come out of Vietnam, where the South Vietnamese police chief, Saigon police chief, is actually executing a Viet Cong suspect. And no trial, just an execution. And the rule of law now is broken down in South Vietnam. A lot of Americans now turn their views against the war in Vietnam, bring the troops home. Demonstrations everywhere, like this one. Nixon was elected in '68, saying that he's going to end the war in Vietnam, and his plan is Vietnamization, just to turn the war over to the Vietnamese. Woodstock in the summer of 1969, a music festival. I entered the Army in 1969. This is me at Fort Walters, going primary flight training. Fast forward slightly to 1975, the official end of the Vietnam War. All the American troops are pulled out by Nixon in 1973. In 1975, the North Vietnamese attacked all in Washington, with 58,000 names of Americans who were killed in Vietnam. 1969, of course, we land a man on the moon. President Kennedy had decided that we would land a man on the moon in this decade, and we do so. I must admit, I was a little disappointed in the book's covering of John Lewis's active career as a congressman from Georgia. Here he is with President Carter and with President Reagan and with President Bill Clinton, with Obama and with George Bush. President Obama giving John Lewis the Medal of Freedom in 2011. Here he is with Senator at the time, but now, of course, President Joe Biden. And he spoke at Principia College in 1999, as Marilee informed you. And his big, the takeaway from the John Lewis talk at Principia College was, don't give up and don't give in. Lewis says, we all arrived in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. And one of my favorite, before I finish my talk, I always have to have a picture of my wife, Dorsey. This is she and I think in 1969, Howard House. I often get very positive comments about my talks with Principia folks, but I always also get more positive comments about Dorsey. She was former Dean of Students, and people always want me to include a picture of her. John Lewis on the cover of Time magazine. And one of my favorite quotes of John Lewis, when people tell me nothing has changed, I say, walk in my shoes and I'll show you change. He has seen it in the civil rights movement, John Lewis. Robbie, did we come up with any questions? If you did, thanks for listening. Any questions, Robbie?
Well, to begin by starting with what the previous talk's question was, what kind of other resources can people pursue to learn more about John Lewis or the civil rights era?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. Look in the bibliography of Jon Meacham's book, and there are 3 books that he recommends by Taylor Branch, and I do as well. I've read a lot of Taylor Branch, and I like his style of writing. There's 2 called America in the King Years, 1954 to 63, and then 63 to 68 by Taylor Branch. And then also Eric Foner, who is the guy on Reconstruction. He has 2 books. One is called Forever Free, The Story of Emancipation and Reconstruction. And he also has a book just called Reconstruction. His name again is Eric Foner. And then, of course, we also have Lewis's own books, March, Book 3, March, Book 2, and with Michael D'Orsio, a book called Walking with the Wind, and another called Christian Peace and Nonviolence. And if you want a novel, I recommend Harper Lee, To Kill a Mockingbird. Anything else, Robbie?
Nothing yet. So we invite others to submit questions. We'd love to hear what things out of the book or out of the context of the civil rights movement people would like Dr. Glen to speak of. I know I'd love to hear when John Lewis moved through his life and had the civil rights experiences. The book seems to end, as you mentioned, right after the assassination of President Kennedy. And so what do you think are the defining moments after that point? What things in his life stand out to you after that point?
Yeah, he, of course, he is reelected to be the congressman from Georgia. I think it's the 5th district. It encompasses Atlanta. He's reelected 17 times. The people in Georgia think that he's the right guy to serve as their congressman. To get reelected 17 times, I mean, that says something right there. Also, Lewis getting the Medal of Freedom in 2011 from Barack Obama, that's certainly got to be one of the highlights of his life. He says in the some reading that I did on him that the Montgomery bus boycott really showed him that nonviolence could be successful. And that, of course, is his argument throughout his efforts at civil rights, nonviolence. And to be spit upon, to be beaten the way he was, to be degraded by people all around you and not turn to violence, a tough thing to do. And John Lewis is able to do it. God love him.
Absolutely. Well, a question comes in asking if you're familiar with the graphic novels and what is their target audience?
If I'm familiar with what, Robbie?
The graphic novels. I think they're referring to one of the other resources you mentioned.
Oh, I'm not. I'm not much of a novel reader. Of course, I read To Kill a Mockingbird when I was in school, but I spend most of my time now reading history and not very many novels. I've just finished Rick Atkinson's book called The British Are Coming, the first volume of his 3-volume set on the Revolutionary War, and I recommend that highly. And also virtually anything that Rick Atkinson writes. He has a 3-volume series on World War II that's just excellent. And if you're looking to increase your vocabulary, Rick Atkinson is the guy to read. Dorsey, I read a lot of my books to Dorsey, and she always has her phone ready for me to tell her, hey, I don't know what this word means. And I feel like I'm a relatively educated individual, but Atkinson's vocabulary is unbelievable. I'd love to know what he uses for a thesaurus.
I guess that is it's a good encouragement. Why would you say it is important for, let's say, students or us in the modern era to remember John Lewis? What kind of impact should we hold about his impact on history?
Yeah, I would argue that he's right at the very pinnacle of the leaders of the civil rights movement. And prior to the civil rights movement that you could argue begins in the late 40s, and all the way up to the present day, of course, with the Black Lives Matter and all the stuff that's going on, the trial in Minneapolis right now. He is at the pinnacle of the leaders. Martin Luther King Jr. probably the most vocal and most noticed, but John Lewis right there with him. And you've seen in this slideshow and in the book, they're tight, they're close pals and work together. And so knowing more about John Lewis has value. And I couldn't be more pleased that George Moffett was able to get him to speak at Principia in 1999. I remember the talk very well. I was in attendance, and his talk and Colin Powell's talk are my 2 favorites. And the distinguished speaker program that George Moffett put together for Principia College was unbelievable, just terrific. We had George Bush, we had Maya Angelou, we had Margaret Thatcher. We had some powerful names, Barack Obama, before he was president, of course. It was an expensive program, but gosh, I think worth the money.
Absolutely. We've got a great comment and a great question coming. So one of our attendees shares that Across the Bridge by John Lewis is an excellent book that describes his dedication to Christian values. And this commenter says that the chapter on patience talks about the work he did in DC and how that patience plays an incredible role in working in the political machine.
Oh, so true, so true. John Lewis is a Democrat, of course, but he is known for being not only the conscience of the Congress, but also reaching, as they say, across the aisle to work with the Republicans in, especially, of course, passing African-American bills and the like.
Well, your comment ties right into this next question, which asks, how would you compare today's hyperpolarized climate versus that time in John Lewis's politically formative years, or I guess the whole civil rights era? How would you compare and contrast those?
Sometimes we allow ourselves to be depressed over the polarization, you're absolutely right, of the Congress. 50 and 50, half and half, the country certainly split. I try to remain as positive as I can about this, because you have to remember, and as a historian, this occurs to me all the time. In fact, one of my main foci is the Civil War. And the genius of American government, I always tell my students, is the ability to compromise. And right now, that ability to compromise is being challenged. But the ability to compromise was really challenged in 1860, when the ability to compromise was non-existent, and it results in the American Civil War, which results in roughly 700,000 Americans killed. And so while things are tough now, and we are disappointed that the Congress can't seem to do what we would like to have them do, things have been worse. And we just have to remain positive. And it's a shame, isn't it, that we lose some leaders like John Lewis. We just have to be hopeful that more people like John Lewis can step forward in the current political scheme.
I suppose it ties into the comments he made at Principia College to don't give up.
Don't give up, don't give in. That was his message to the students. I'm sure if our listeners are interested, they can send an email to either you or Marilee to watch that talk. If you haven't seen it, if you weren't there, send an email in, and folks at Principia will send you the URL. It's about an hour long or so, but very inspiring talk, and I would recommend it strongly.
Absolutely. I think that is all the time that we'll have for questions tonight. Thank you all for staying a little over with us, and thank you to John for this fantastic talk and for joining us today. So the recording of this is available just tomorrow on the virtual events webpage. You'll get your link in case you dropped in or out of attending this, and so that'll appear in your inbox. If you'd like to continue your learning experience, please do join us on our civil rights trip titled Civil Rights, A Journey to Freedom with Dr. Billy Miller, Principia College professor. That's in March of next year, and we're looking forward to it.
Sounds like a great trip.
Yes, yes. Hopefully I'll see you there, John.
Yeah.
So virtual
Thanks, Robbie.
event. Yes, other virtual events coming up are the April Book Club pick, The Night Portrait, a novel of World War II. It's by Laura Morelli, and that's on April 29th, which is a Thursday. Finally, we'll also have an early childhood principal, Dorothy Halverson, talk on teaching the Bible and spiritual concepts to young children. So hope you'll join us for all of these things. Thank you all for attending, and have a great rest of your evening.